lies broken between us, lines of connection down, standing in ruins of pain and mistrust, searching for common ground. So we stumble through our points of view, logic falls apart. In that moment of confusion, we see a place to start through the windows of heart. We sit in silence and wonder, where do we go from here? Frustration dragging us under, no resolution clear. We feel the anger, this desperation to turn this world around. Each of our faces a mirror, searching for common ground. So we lower our defenses, watch them fall apart. In that moment of confusion, we see a place to start through the windows of So we lower our defenses, watch them fall apart. In that moment of communion, we see a place to start through the windows of It's a good thing I love having a tough act to follow. So we lower our defenses to look for common ground. And when we are doing that, it's often because we're trying to understand why the world we know should be has yet to materialize. I'm wondering, is this world turning out exactly how you all thought it would? I mean, anything about this world that you might have thought we would have fixed by now? Like what? Tell me what. Here, I'll take a list.
Pollution.
Mm-hmm. What else?
Homelessness. Education and
Racism.
Oh. Why is the list so long? Why do we always expect better things, almost as if we expect them to improve automatically? Well, this myth of inevitable moral progress is what we're here to debunk. Let me start with a story. At a history conference, I once met a very learned man, and I knew he was learned because he told me so. Calling himself an extreme pacifist, sort of said it like that, he presented a paper denouncing the Civil War, and he suggested that the Union Army, because it had the morally superior position, should have shown restraint and allowed the Confederate States to secede. And he claimed that since all war is necessarily wrong, he argued that eventually the truth would come to light, and all peoples would one day come together and end slavery in one glorious group hug. They're my words, not his. He was a learned man. It was a crime for all those people to die, he proclaimed. And since humankind moves toward progress onward and upward forever, we should not have then, nor should we now, view the Civil War's ending of slavery with violence as victory. So, the first thing that popped into my head is, what did the black folks think about this argument? Anyone of conscience, in fact. And I realized I was so disturbed, I was shaking. So at the question and answer session, I said, so what about the slaves? Don't you think we should have tried to end their killing and chaining and torturing and demeaning? Were we supposed to wait until some magical moment when slavery would poof disappear? Doesn't this value white lives over black lives? I concluded sometimes our only means of safety and salvation is a stout and vigorous defense of ourselves and those we know are being oppressed. Yes, I brought my high horse and I climbed upon it. So this very learned man began to shout at me, after which I probably raised my voice, as I am wont to do in such confrontations. It is immoral to place a timetable on someone else's freedom. Evil must be confronted and thwarted wherever it stalks our streets. He saw moral progress as inevitable, and he chose to progress towards annoying me in the dining hall during lunch until a friend invited him to leave me alone. One thing this encounter made clear to me is that my greatest fear is allowing an injustice that I can identify and that I could dismantle, allowing it to outlive me. Despite the many failings of the United States, of all the episodes in our nation's history, and I say this as a transplanted Southerner with the blood of Robert E. Lee in my veins, the Union victory over the slave empire proves that a people can rise up and risk all in solidarity with another people so they can end suffering and tyranny and bring a better world into being. Inevitable progress onward and upward forever is foolishness, best. A license to ignore evil, oppression, and suffering. Hold up your hands. Look at them. Feel their strength and sinew. These are the instruments of moral progress, not some magical fairy dust of inevitable goodness. Our moral courage, our personal honor, our civic duty, they all coalesce in organizing together across all the intersections of identity
to bend that arc of the moral universe toward greater justice, to get dirty in the act of social improvement and justice making, of restoration and reparation. Amen. I may not be so learned, but I do know this to be true. Goodness and mercy often require us to sacrifice some of our own fortune, safety, power, and privilege to move the world closer to a community that is truly beloved. Future generations shall rightly judge us by how honestly we examine the world that we are given and enact remedies for its injustices. Teenage climate activist Greta Thunberg just reminded us that the world's children have their eyes and hopes fixed on whether or not we will respond to the climate emergency before us. Glory comes to those who toil to transform the world of our birth into the world that we know should be. So where comes this abscessed sense of historical optimism? Progress, Onward and Upward Forever was composed by the transcendentalist James Freeman Clarke, a Unitarian minister who served the Church of the Disciples in Boston for 40 years. Revising the 5 points of Calvinism in 1886, Clarke's 5 points of the new theology proclaimed the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, the leadership of Jesus, salvation by character, the progress of mankind, onward and upward forever.
Did you hear all that man in there?
There's a whole lot of men dancing around in there, in the language of the age. And they're all decent concepts, except for perhaps the last one, in my eyes. Clarke declared the one fact which is written on nature and human life is the fact of progress. And this must be accepted as the purpose of the Creator. I'm not trying to trash the name and memory of good Mr. Clarke. Perhaps it was convenient for a person of his privilege and station to believe the myth of inevitable progress in 1886. The Union had won the war to supposedly end slavery. The Industrial Revolution was bringing all sorts of wonders to life. The astronomy and medicine and chemistry were bringing about new miracles. Railroads shortened the distances between people. But what were people like Clarke not looking at? We know the end of the 1800s saw the dismantling of Reconstruction, voting rights stolen away from African Americans, great poverty and disease in our cities, terrible working conditions in our factories, the composition of a new apartheid that used the courts and the so-called rule of law to reinstitute de facto slavery for non-white people. We see what we want to see until grace or circumstance forces us to gaze inward to discern deeper truths. Amen. The 20th century brought overwhelming evidence of the myth of inevitable progress and the need for us to toil for betterment. After the horrors of the First World War, Europe's intellectual like W.H. Auden from our reading, they became aghast at what human beings were capable of doing to one another on large scales. In 1917, Ernest Hemingway, the writer, served an ambulance unit like UUCM's own Paul Gannett Osborne. His plaque is back there on our sanctuary wall, the first American casualty of World War I from this congregation. Hemingway wrote of the lack of faith that the war engendered. He has a story called A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. And in the story, an old waiter takes the latest shift that he can. And after he closes his restaurant, he roams from cafe to cafe until there's no cafes open anymore. And then he wanders and eventually gets home. And when he's home on his bed, before the sun is rising, his waiter recites a sad and empty version of the Lord's Prayer, where he substitutes the word nada, meaning nothing, for the words heaven and God and kingdom. It goes something like this: nada, who art in nada, nada be thy name. Faith is gone by the treachery and the butchery of the First World War in his mind. And his faith isn't just lost in God. The waiter cannot even sleep until he sees with his own eyes the sun rising. He has so little faith, he doesn't even believe tomorrow will come until he sees it himself with his own eyes. Only then does he fall asleep. The convenient myth of inevitable progress appears hollow and corrosive.
I want onward and upward forever to be true. Right? Don't you?
Amen.
I want to know that even if I close my eyes for a day, that work of moral progress will go on, because these hands get really tired, right?
Yeah, blisters.
These hands get really tired of holding on. Auden was sitting in a cafe on the eve of World War II. I was walking on the sands of a Connecticut beach when the second tower fell. And I know I don't say that without the implicit invitation to you to remember where you were when the myth of our impermeable, shining city on a hill tumbled in ash and flame. You feel me, right?
That's right.
We shoulder the terror together. It is the only way we, a collective we, survive. You know, it was the pilots who suffered grief in the most insidious way, all the commercial American pilots across the industry. The planes that proclaim our dominion over the skies were proved violable, and worse, they were weaponized. How could they, the pilots, enter again into those cockpits and assume those controls? Many did not. Some that I know from United set down their wings forever, and some that held on do so with an unassailable grief. They learned that dominion and control are illusions, and that tenderness and fragility are real. So did we, right?
Amen.
It is so good to see you, Miranda. Amen to you.
Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
And at first, this realization of our vulnerability is utter hell,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
But it opens us up to a new kind of heaven. After 9/11, the congregation that I served outside of Washington, D.C. vigilantly set to building relationships with our Muslim neighbors. Our work was beautiful, but it was steeped in an aching sense of our vulnerability. If 300 lives could be taken in an instant, and if a war with Iraq, a war with a nation whose people shared the same skin tone as the attackers and little else, could be sparked with the timber of our American grief, would our relationships, one to another over halal curry and rice, would they stand? Would they survive the next wave of hate? We were feeling our tenderness, our fragility, and these feelings were compelling us to do the work. You see, you can do two things with tenderness and vulnerability.
Yeah.
The first thing you can do is let that brainstem that tells us fight or flight. Speak to us its only truth. Tenderness and vulnerability say, fight or run away. And then we have a choice. How are we going to fight? Are we going to fight with love? Or are we going to let fear steal us from our neighbors? It is only when we shoulder the terror together that a collective we survives. We, non-Muslims, were moving through our grief and our fear, not letting our vulnerability cripple us. While our Muslim friends were moving through the hell and the indignity of a landslide of hate and the existential vulnerability of their Muslim bodies on this American soil. Our Muslim neighbors, they had and they still have to write and send a press release every other day.
Yep.
Exhibiting an uber patriotism that I have never had to exhibit. In the wake of domestic terror or ISIS raids or anti-Semitic violence or earthquakes in Haiti, they have to assert on official documents their love of all humanity, and they have to do this again and again and again to prove to who is watching, and everyone is watching. They have to prove that they love America and are good and worthy human beings, that they belong in that collective we. And they have to do this because they are on the edge, on the margins, where any misstep can mean alienation, deportation, or death, because America is expecting them to fail, to prove the myth that they are inherently dangerous, to prove that myth. Our trajectory is not onward and upward forever. We heard teenage indigenous climate activist Shu Tizkat Martinez demand that politicians act on behalf of future generations. He knows, and we are coming to know, that the arc of the moral universe does not bend eliminatively towards justice, that our bodies, our souls, and the body of this green earth is vulnerable. Enter Reverend Elizabeth Wynne, a Unitarian Universalist who, aware of the tremendous pressure we feel to right the world's ills, shares. We, when our efforts feel frustrating and hopeless, when we expected to see other outcomes, when our people's bodies are dying in the streets and we have no idea how to be all right.
Wow.
We bend the arc. How? With our presence. By staying in the vulnerability and the work. Even when vulnerability steals our courage and threatens to turn us towards fear. And you know how we bend it? We bend it by bending towards one another, not away. By bending towards one another, tender, fragile, vulnerable, and toward.
That's right.
God, in our time for all ages, was searching for a hiding place for God's self, for holiness, for the spark of the divine. It couldn't be in the earth. We would mine for treasures there. It couldn't even be on the moon. We'd get there before we were ready. So God, as the story goes, as the metaphor goes, placed that spark of the divine deep down, deep in our own hearts. Right?
Yes.
We may not always see it there, but perhaps we can see it in others. The arc of the moral universe may not bend eliminatively towards justice, and we may not go onward and upward forever, but when we go inward, right, to our own hearts, and inward to the hearts of our neighbors, the arc bends with us. Amen?
Amen.
We must love one another or die. You know, Auden wanted to rewrite that poem. He thought that line especially trite. And he grew a bit uncomfortable with the darkness that he had set forth in those lines, and they are dark. But the public, a world of readers, wouldn't have it. He was speaking our tremendous and nearly unmentionable grief. A grief that we feel again in the grips of our climate crisis. A grief because the spinning of time does not heal all wounds.
That's right.
A grief because we cannot trust anything save that most tender and broken of things, our own capacity to love.
Wow.
The public needed that. We need that, even if it aches to confront it. And so, I don't put my faith in the illimitable progress, onward and upward, but I put my faith in you. Will you put your faith in me and in one another?
Yes.
We're just going to have a little pause here. That was a good song. I put my faith in music, especially today. And I put my faith in you. Will you put your faith in me and in one another? Will you put your faith in those beyond our walls? Will you put your faith in those who are aching so much that they look strange and frightening to us? That's a tough one, right? Can you put your faith in the holy that lives within their hearts? And how about those broken by our many mythologies? Myths that say that poverty is a sign of weakness, that oppression is necessary, that pain is deserved, that worth is a matter of biology, and life at the margins is expendable. Can we put our faith not in these myths, but in the hearts of those myths obscure? Can we do that? If we do this, we are building and we are bending. We are building the beloved community, and we are bending the arc a mighty long way. Amen.